Well, it seems like Magic the Gathering really wanted me to put my foot in my mouth. Just as I was criticizing the direction of the game, moving more and more towards Universes Beyond, they decided to announce all of the upcoming in-universe sets for 2027. And honestly, they look pretty good. Let's take some time today to highlight some of the upcoming things for in-universe Magic and talk about what there is to be excited about with Magic the Gathering.
Distraction makers.
Reality Fracture is basically a revisiting of the idea that you can take Magic and kind of reimagine how things might be. It's sort of a what-if set, kind of in the lineage of a previous block called Time Spiral. And Time Spiral was back when we had 3-set blocks. The Time Spiral block was the set Time Spiral, Planar Chaos, and then Future Sight. And the theme for the set was past, present, and future. So Time Spiral is focused on the past, and they did these things called time-shifted cards, where basically they took some kind of iconic cards from Magic's history and so reprinted them into the standard environment at the time with these time-shifted cards. So we got some kind of pretty unique play patterns that we hadn't seen in quite a while in that format. Things like the Rack, Psionic Blast, and Achroma. I think this was the first sort of bonus sheet. In every pack, you would get one of these sort of special treatment kind of cards. And that persisted throughout the block. So then we got Planar Chaos, which was the set about the present, which was basically taking things that were happening now and sort of mixing them around into different aspects of the color pie. Mark Rosewater has said that of the sets, this is one he regrets making probably the most because it very explicitly broke color pie conventions. We got things like Harmonize, which is just straight card draw for green. We got Damnation, which is a Wrath of God, but in black. But I think part of what Mark doesn't like about Planar Chaos is that oftentimes players will point to cards that were color shifted from that set and basically say, well, this exists, so why can't we have that now? And I think it's important to remember that at the time, Magic's design was handled much differently because it wasn't being designed for an eternal world. These cards were meant to come into sort of the standard format, which was the focus of design at the time, and they would hang around for a year or two, and then they would rotate out. But now that we sort of live in this eternal design-centric world, I think it's a bit more difficult for them to experiment in this kind of way because these things will hang around forever. And then when we got to Future Sight was obviously the set focused on the future. And in this set, you got future shifted cards, which had this weird card frame, and they basically previewed, they sort of gave kind of these teasers about what was coming in Magic's future. And the set had over 40 mechanics and keywords, so it was extremely complicated. Veteran players liked this block a lot, and it's kind of become a cult classic. But at the time, new players were really turned off by this idea because it was almost like too meta, right? But we got some really interesting ideas out of Future Sight with mechanics like Gravestorm on the card Bitter Ordeal, which I don't think has come back yet. I'm going to double check. If there's other Gravestorm cards, I'll put them on the screen. This was the first time we saw Delve. And also, this was the first mention of Planeswalkers on the card Tarmogoyf. Reportedly, Planeswalkers were actually supposed to come out in Future Sight, but apparently some of the design they couldn't quite nail down in time, and so they got pushed to Lorwyn. So the Lorwyn 5 should actually be the Future Sight 5. So it's kind of interesting. So Reality Fracture does have some pretty big shoes to fill because it is paying homage to this kind of cult classic block from 2006. So instead of doing like really strict color shifting or time shifting or future shifted cards or whatever, they're basically just taking the idea of a character and portraying them in two different colors, sort of like in an alternate reality, this character could have turned out this other way. And I think that's, sort of to capture that story theme of Jace creating this alternative reality. So we did get the Lorwyn 5 Planeswalker spoiled. The first one is a Johnny Resolute, which costs 1 and a white. Whenever you gain life, put a loyalty counter on a Johnny. You can pay 0 loyalty counters to gain 1 life, which is effectively +1. You can -4 to create a 2/2 white cat soldier creature named Ajani Pridemate with whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on this token. And you can -10 to gain an emblem with creatures you control get +2/+2. And he starts with 2 loyalty. And then the sort of mirror universe form of Ajani is called Ajani Unrelenting. Costs 4 generic and 2 red. He says whenever you activate a loyalty ability, create a 2/2 colorless wizard soldier creature token named Cadet. +1 loyalty. Creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain haste until end of turn. He has a -2 that says discard your hand and then draw a card for each creature you control. And he has a -3 that says Ajani deals 4 damage to each creature except for tokens you control. And he starts with 5 loyalty. The only thing I'll mention here design-wise is that the Ajani Resolute is creating a token that is literally of another Magic card, which I don't know, feels a little bit crufty, a little bit weird. I suppose you could just use the card itself as the token, but then you might confuse players when they're doing things like, well, if something's mana value matters, or if it's put into a graveyard or exiled or whatever it is, there's different, you treat a token differently than you treat a regular card. And so if you're using the regular card as the token, I think players might end up kind of maybe not resolving these effects correctly. Yes, we live in a commander-centric world where that sort of matters less. As long as everybody's just sort of happy with the game unfolds, everything's fine. But if we're talking about how to design effects that players are more likely to execute correctly, I think this one's kind of a medium risk. Next, we have the Garrick Veiled Butcher, who costs 3 and 2 black. If a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. He has a +2 that says up to 1 target creature gets -4/-1 until your next turn. -2, which says each player sacrifices a creature of their choice. If you sacrificed a creature this way, create a 4/4 green beast creature token with trample. And he has a -3 that says each opponent discards 2 cards. For each opponent who didn't discard 2 non-land cards this way, you draw a card. And he starts with 5 loyalty. And then the mirror universe version of Garrick costs 3 and 2 green. It says whenever a creature you control with power 4 or greater enters, draw a card. Has a +2 that says untap up to 2 target lands. Has a -3 that says create a 4/4 beast creature token with trample. And he has a -4 that says until your next turn, whenever 1 or more creatures attack one of your opponents, those creatures get +2/+2 and gain trample until end of turn. And he starts with 5 loyalty. It is interesting that I think they've decided generally planeswalkers need like a static ability to make them basically a more powerful enchantment. This is something that's been going on for quite a while with cards like Narset and Teferi, but I think this does feel a little bit commander-centric to me, where you want your cards to have an effect, and an effect that matters probably on other people's turns, and especially because planeswalkers are particularly bad in a 4-player multiplayer format where you have 3 other players that have the opportunity to attack your planeswalker before you're going to get another turn to activate their abilities. And so this does put an amount of pressure on abilities that are activated only on your turn and only once per turn. So having a kind of global effect on these planeswalkers is kind of a way to get around that. But the other thing is that it seems like they felt they needed to add some amount of clarity to effects that say sacrifice a creature. They've added sacrifice a creature of your choice. And that probably means they were just getting some amount of feedback from newer players that were sort of saying, you sacrifice that creature. They're thinking this was like a targeted ability. Next, we have Chandra, Torch of Defiance. She costs 2 and 2 red. She has a +1 that says exile the top card of your library. You may cast that card. If you don't, Chandra deals 2 damage to each opponent. She has a +1 that says add 2 red. She has a -3 that says Chandra deals 4 damage to target creature. And she has a -7 that says you get an emblem with whenever you cast a spell. This emblem deals 5 damage to any target. And she starts with 4 loyalty. Her sort of mirror universe version is Chandra, Chill of Compliance. Okay. She costs 1 and 2 blue. She has a +1 that says Surveil 1. If you put a non-creature, non-land card into your graveyard this way, put that card into your hand. She has a +1 that says add 1 blue. Spend this mana only to cast a non-creature spell. She has a -X that says tap target artifact or creature, put X stun counters on it, and then her -6 is you get an emblem with whenever you cast a spell, draw a card. She starts with 3 loyalty. I'm not really a huge fan of sort of the emblem creep that's been happening. I imagine at some point we will get a spell that interacts with emblems, but currently there's really no way to affect emblems at all. It almost is like an additional card type that's just sort of started to creep into the game. And it does add just sort of some weird cruft, right? You have to have a way to sort of track all these emblems that you have. They have various different effects. So emblem tokens obviously are in the packs of cards to go along with some of these abilities. But it does feel like it is kind of in line with that sort of parallel play thing we've been talking about, where there's these effects that are happening. There's no real way to do anything about it once they've happened. You basically have to act before they get to the emblem. So at least you have the opportunity to do that. But I think this is maybe a danger zone, and I'm wondering if at some point we see a card that just gives you an emblem, if that's the point where we would start to see interaction that can affect emblems. They're not permanents, although I suppose they could be made into permanents, and then that would open up a whole host of interaction that could interact with them. And in some ways, I kind of wish they had done that. They feel a little sort of, parasitic's not the right word. They feel a little isolated, right? They feel a little sequestered away from Magic's initial systems in a way that the Planeswalker cards themselves, I think, did an okay job of integrating themselves into the system, where they made things like Lightning Bolt able to target Planeswalkers. There's a little bit of rules complexity to do that, but I think in the terms of emblems, you could have just made them permanents, and then that would have solved it, right? But I suppose if you're using your Planeswalker's Ultimate, you want to get a payoff, and then that thing needs to stick around, whatever. Okay, next we have Liliana, and Liliana is actually not a Planeswalker in this set, but we have Liliana the Faultless, who costs 1 white. She's a legendary creature, human cleric. It says, whenever another creature or Planeswalker you control enters, you gain 1 life. She has pay 1 and tap her, discard a card. Another target creature or Planeswalker you control gains hexproof until end of turn. And she's a 1/1. Then we have Liliana the Repentant. She costs 1 and a black. She's a legendary creature, human warlock. Whenever another creature or Planeswalker you control enters, mill 2 cards. She also has an exhaust ability that says pay 5 and a black to return target creature or Planeswalker card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Put a +1/+1 counter on Liliana. Activate only as a sorcery. So yeah, the Liliana the Faultless is sort of referencing some other like famous cards. She's like a kind of a power-crept Soul Warden on top of kind of a Mother of Runes, maybe not quite as powerful as Mother of Runes, but definitely referencing that sort of Soul Sister archetype, right, where you've got Soul Warden, Mother of Runes, these sort of 1-cost, 1/1 creatures that have kind of this ongoing cumulative effect or ability to protect other creatures. So could be a cool idea for some kind of a commander deck. She would be a good commander for that style of game plan. And then her black version, Liliana the Repentant, this is bringing in Exhaust. And they had mentioned that Exhaust was probably going to be like sort of at least a deciduous, maybe an evergreen keyword, where we were going to see it more often outside of Ether Drift. One of the things that's always kind of bothered me about this ability is that it has a lot of upkeep issues. There's not really a good way to track whether or not you've activated this ability. A lot of them put +1/+1 counters on the creature once you've activated the Exhaust ability, just to give you kind of an indicator that says, yeah, you did actually use this ability since it's only once per game. There's also some weirdness with being able to flicker the creature and then you can use it again. It's like another instance, another copy of that Exhaust ability, which would allow you to use it an additional time. But I do think that you enter into pretty dangerous upkeep territory when you do these Exhaust abilities and you don't give players any way to track them. The card that immediately comes to mind is Loot the Pathfinder, where Loot the Pathfinder costs 2 and a teamer, has double strike, vigilance, and haste. Has 3 different Exhaust abilities. The first one is pay a green and tap it to add 3 mana of 1 color. Second one is pay a blue and tap it to draw 3 cards. And its third one is pay a red and tap it, and loot deals 3 damage to any target. And none of these abilities give you a particularly good way to track which of them you've already used. I don't know. I think if we end up in a situation where there's a lot of Exhaust creatures in a deck and this ability starts to become more prevalent in the game, as they seem to plan to do, they probably should add a +1/+1 counter so players have an easier way to track it. But even then, that's like still not great. And really the biggest issue is that, let's say you use one of these abilities early on in the game. With Liliana, you can play her turn 2, right? And buy her, even on curve, you're playing her on turn 2. And you activate this ability on turn 3, and then you end up at like turn 7 later in the game. And you're thinking, did I use this ability already? Have I done this? I don't remember exactly, and maybe nobody else at the table does either, and then you get to use the ability again. Or maybe something happened where Liliana maybe got removed from combat instead of flickered, and you're like, oh, well, maybe I should be able to use this again, and just creates kind of just these fuzzy scenarios, which again, commander-centric world, doesn't matter as much, but I would hope that you would focus on keeping these things more consistent, even if it's just for casual play. I think over time, these things can kind of erode your tightness of rules design to ensure that, yes, even though it's a casual game, the game will more than likely function as intended. We have the new Jace was spoiled as well. We have the Theorist, Jace Bellerin, cost 2 and 2 blue. At the beginning of each opponent's draw step, draw a card. It has a +1 that says create a 1/1 blue illusion creature token. He has a -2 that says for each opponent, return up to 1 target artifact or creature that player controls to its owner's hand. Then he has a -6 that says draw 3 cards, then put X +1/+1 counters on each creature you control, where X is the number of cards in your hand. And he starts with 3 loyalty. Not much to say about this one. I think he's fine. I think his abilities are relatively evocative of the story that they're attempting to tell. And again, we see that sort of static ability here that I think they're maybe resolved that Planeswalkers need these static abilities. It's kind of crazy to think about, like, when Planeswalkers first came out, that they were extremely powerful, and now we're sort of like needing to power creep them to keep up with everything else. And finally, we can kind of see what I think more of the theme of the set will be with 2 cards in particular, which are Tiny Bones and Titan Bones, which are basically just the same character but seen in kind of a mirrored universe. So I think we're going to see a lot of these sort of duos throughout the set. Man, I think this brings me to kind of my biggest sort of critique of the set, is that it feels a lot like you are relying on players to be invested in kind of the characters themselves in this way to tell the sort of mirror universe theory, where we're not doing anything that feels particularly all that innovative or dangerous the way that we did in Planar Chaos, where you literally were getting these effects in other colors that you'd never seen before, and that was really exciting. I get why they can't do that now, but I do think that for someone who's been playing as long as I have, you start to think about, like, okay, well, like, this is interesting, but what are the actual sort of mechanical, innovative game things that this idea is bringing? What are the new ideas here? The set looks good, and I'm not trying to say that it's going to be bad or anything. I'm just saying that for me, I think that part of what feels a little fine here, right, instead of it feeling great, like it feels good instead of feeling great here, is that, again, you are relying on the character stories to tell these things. Like the red Ajani is just a red card that happens to be Ajani, right? And so without that sort of character connection here, I don't think that this theme really hits the way that maybe they would want to, or in the way that it could if we were mirroring mechanics. Okay, so next, let's take a pretty quick look at the in-universe sets that were announced for 2027, because these all look pretty sweet. First, we have Noctis, which is a entirely underwater world. All they've really said about the story is that it involves a conflict between 2 kingdoms, and there's an apocalyptic danger at the bottom of the ocean. And game design-wise, the thing that's interesting here is they have announced that they're going to be doing a new evasion mechanic, similar to flying or horsemanship, where you have this sort of additional combat vector to get combat damage through. They said that it isn't just a reskin of flying, so the fears of it being something like sea horsemanship are probably pretty unfounded. But I think we could speculate for just a minute about what sea horsemanship might be. We could take a look at something like what has happened with Shroud and then Hexproof and then Ward. And I am wondering if they're looking for some amount of granularity in the ability for something like flying to work. So we could get an effect that's something like cannot be blocked unless your opponent does X. And X could be pay mana, X could be discard a card, like just like Ward, it gives you a lot more design space to play around with. A few other things that I briefly saw other people online discussing was something like if creatures attack together, they can't be blocked, those kinds of things. They were suggesting that it might feel a bit like fish that are schooling together. And the other thing that I was considering is maybe it's a little bit even more beyond just not being able to be blocked. Maybe it's something like the creature can't be affected, like it's submerged, so it can't be targeted, it can't be blocked until something happens. And then it's sort of a binary, right? Instead of something that's being like and needing to be satisfied every turn. It could be something like once it's satisfied, now it can be blocked. The other thing that's kind of interesting here to try to make this mechanic a little less parasitic could be if they attached it to some other kind of mechanic, like cannot be blocked unless, or can only be blocked by other creatures with seahorsemanship or haste, or first strike, or something like that, that just gives another sort of knob here of interaction. I don't really feel like this will be the case. My gut says this is going to be something that's a bit more granular. And next we have Kamigawa Titan Breach, and this looks sweet, right? Where not only are we returning to Kamigawa, which is in its sort of second iteration with Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, this was sort of a reimagining of the original Kamigawa, instead set sort of in the sci-fi future. And now we're seeing the plane of Ikoria sort of being smashed into Kamigawa. And this, while it feels like the world building here is sort of a little loose compared to other stuff, it doesn't feel like the hat sets did, where we're just sort of taking characters and placing them in a different plane and putting a cowboy hat on them or a detective hat or whatever, right? We're getting this mashup of mechs from Kamigawa fighting the sort of behemoths of Ikoria in sort of that mech versus kaiju genre trope fashion. Not really much to speculate on here other than the Omen paths are basically this, so we're probably going to see more of this type of thing going into the future, and I'm sure there could be other interesting mashups to be had. And finally, the third set that will be coming out in 2027 for in-universe Magic is called Zhalfir, which is technically a return to a plane that we've never been to before. Zhalfir originally was an island on Dominaria that Teferi phased out during this I don't know if it's the Brothers' War or what, but basically it got phased out. Oh, it was during the Phyrexian invasion. So during the Phyrexian invasion, Teferi phased out Zhalfir, and then now I think we're seeing it kind of as its own plane. It sounds like this plane is sort of designed to take the place of Mirrodin after Mirrodin became New Phyrexia. And so it's a world with 5 suns where the sun never sets, and then there's kind of this spirit world where it's always night, which feels a little like Lorwyn, but the plane itself does have a pretty distinct identity, which is grounded in what's called Afrofuturism or Afrofantasy, which is a genre of fantasy that focuses on the folklore, the mythology of African cultures. This genre has been around for quite a while, but really started to come into the limelight recently with books like Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi, and also with like the Black Panther movie from Marvel. And this is not the first time we've seen fantasy venture into this kind of territory. Way back in 2001, we had the world called Neambe that was created by Christopher Delunt. D&D has sort of its own worlds. Chult, I think, is the sort of D&D setting equivalent, which I think early on was criticized because it was just sort of a jungle. Like there wasn't a whole lot there. But in recent times, they've spent some effort to try to flesh out that world and make it feel more like another place that you could actually set a campaign in. So yeah, it's great to see Magic have sort of its own version of this genre of fantasy. And I'm super excited to see how the set develops and the mechanics and everything. But right now, we basically just have some art from the set, and some of the artists and art directors that have worked on it have sort of discussed kind of their conceptual ideas. This is the home plane for Teferi, so I assume that he'll be involved in some way. But yeah, I think we'll just have to see what that set holds in the future. But let me know in the comments. I'm curious to hear which of the new sets look the best to you. It'll be fascinating to see what seahorsemanship actually ends up being. I hope that we continue to see new and original Magic worlds to this caliber versus sort of the hat set stuff that we had seen previously in the last few years. As I think this gives in-universe Magic a real leg to stand on if there's any kind of internal struggle as to like whether or not you keep in-universe sets around rather than just going full universes beyond. I hope that these sets provide a pathway to make that happen. Obviously, earlier in the year, we had Lorwyn and Strixhaven, which both have reportedly done pretty well. So ideally, we will continue to see at least a 50-50 split between universes beyond and universes within going into the future. If you like the video, make sure you like it, subscribe to the channel. If you're looking for a community of like-minded game designers, you can join our Discord. The link is in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.